and welcome to Hello Wants to Know podcast. Hello veut savoir. Today I am with Rick Strassman. Good morning, Dr. Rick Strassman.
Good morning, Eloise. Nice to be on your show.
Nice to have you. Thanks for accepting my invitation. And that was so quick. I was really surprised how fast you were to get back to me. Let me introduce you. So, you are a clinical research psychiatrist, clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico, and you're also a best-selling author of this book I have right here, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, that's been translated to French. It's called DMT, La Molécule de l'Esprit. And you're also, it says on your website, and I like this one, that you're the father of the American psychedelic research renaissance. And I'd like you to explain how you played such an important part in this renaissance.
Well, our study in Albuquerque at the University of New Mexico was the first new human research with psychedelic drugs in a generation. After the passage of the Controlled Substances Act in the US and comparable international legislation, Schedule 1 studies ended, pretty much because of the burdensome, legal requirements to perform any new studies. So the funding dried up, researchers returned their drugs, and it was pretty much a vast wasteland for the next 20 years in terms of human research. Um, Basic science research, continued, and all the discoveries regarding serotonin, actually, and antidepressants and the new generation of antipsychotics, developed, building on the pharmacology of the psychedelics, but there were no comparable human studies to confirm or refute what was being discovered in lower animals. So I was interested in looking for a biological component of altered states of consciousness, and began looking at melatonin in the pineal gland in the mid 1980s. And After determining that melatonin was only sedating, in the meantime, I had learned about DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, which is profoundly psychedelic, and also is made in the human body like melatonin. And so I changed course and began studying DMT, which we began giving in 1990. We completed that study in 1995. I'm also began studying psilocybin at around 93, 94 or so. We established the regulatory framework of interaction between the state, local, and federal agencies, which all subsequent American studies have since followed.
Uh, and for those who are not familiar with DMT, you just gave a brief explanation of what that is, but can you go a little bit more in depth to explain what DMT is and even psilocybin you just mentioned?
Sure. Well, DMT, as I mentioned, stands for dimethyltryptamine. It's a relatively simple molecule, not much larger than blood sugar or glucose, um, and it's widely distributed in the natural world in plants and in animals, including humans.
Hmm.
It's a chemical cousin of serotonin and of melatonin. Um, it is the visionary ingredient in ayahuasca, which is a popular Amazonian psychedelic brew out there.
Yeah.
Um, and Over the last few years, there's been some recent discoveries about it, being produced in the brain, rather than the pineal gland, which is, fine with me. The pineal gland, theory, was a theory, and
Yeah,
it's still,
there is a theory that that it's been made in the pineal gland. Now we don't think that anymore.
well, it's more equivocal, than it, was initially. In the DMT book, I speculate about a pineal, role of synthesizing DMT. That's because of the venerated position of the pineal within esoteric physiologies.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a lot of circumstantial data supporting a pineal site of synthesis. And a paper came out in 2013, describing, the presence of DMT in the fluid around the pineal gland of the living rodent. Uh, but a subsequent study from the same groups, 6 years later in 2019, suggested that it's the brain that makes DMT, and in that original pineal study, it was brain tissue which contained the DMT which they measured, rather than from the pineal gland. So the interesting thing about that 2019 study is that concentrations of DMT are as high in the brain as for well-known neurotransmitters like serotonin and like dopamine. So
Wow.
it points to a potentially fundamental role of DMT in the brain, perhaps even as a neurotransmitter.
So I guess the levels of DMT that we are making are not psychedelic, though. They're just. Can we
Well,
do that?
it depends what you mean by psychedelic. If DMT regulates our perceptual reality, then perhaps we are all in a like a low level DMT experience, mediated by ongoing production of DMT. But strictly speaking, concentrations are within tolerable range to maintain consensus reality. Theoretically, if increases occur in brain levels of DMT, you might see things like non drug related altered states like dreams,
Hmm.
psychosis, near death experiences.
Hmm.
A very interesting aspect of that recent study is that concentrations of DMT increase at death in experimental
Yeah.
uh, heart attacks in rodents, and it increases especially in the visual cortex. Uh, so that's an extra piece of evidence, supporting the notion that DMT elevations play a role in the visual phenomenon anyway of the near death state.
That is, you said so many things there that are so interesting. And near death experiences in themselves are just very, very interesting. And I know you've been talking about them. But I'm still trying to, I struggle because we talk so much about the pineal gland being, where the spiritual awakening happens. And I want to make sure that I really understood you. You're saying that this might not be where this happens when we experience some mystical experience with psychedelics. This is not necessarily in the pineal gland that this happens. Am I correct?
Right, right. It's a lot. Yeah, yeah. It still is an open question.
Okay.
People live normal lives without a pineal gland.
So
Uh,
you can extract pineal gland.
if you have a tumor of the pineal, it has to be removed. If you have a stroke of the pineal gland, it's abolished.
So how
Um,
do you cope with that not having a pineal gland? How does it affect your life?
well, not that much apparently.
Really?
Yeah, it's been some time since I've looked in into the pinealectomy uh, literature.
Hmm.
But when melatonin was first discovered, and there was a big interest in the human physiology of melatonin. There were a handful of clinical reports of people without pineal glands, and they studied them to some extent, and the main problem seemed to be circadian rhythm disturbances,
Okay.
and especially with respect to accommodating the jet lag symptoms which occur with time zone travel.
Yeah. And that would make sense because this is where melatonin is made, right? In the
Uh,
pineal gland. Yeah.
right, right. Yeah, yeah. The main hormone product of the pineal is melatonin.
Gotcha. So, in your studies, you managed to explore some spiritual ground, which is very fascinating as a scientist to try to gauge spiritual experiences. Because it seems that with DMT, um, a lot of people have spiritual or mystical experiences. And why is that? How do you explain that?
Well, how do you explain spiritual experiences from DMT? Well, if naturally occurring spiritual experiences are associated with brain chemistry changes, which only makes sense. Like if you're meditating in a cave for years, if you've been praying, if you're in a group with drumming, near death states, all those have spiritual components. There's extreme emotions, there's visions, there's voices, there's new insights, out of body states. Um, there have to be physical correlates of that, of those profoundly altered states. So it only makes sense if you give the same drugs or chemicals that are elevated in non-drug states, that you can replicate or you can mimic the effects of the non-drug kinds of spiritual uh, experiences which occur without drugs.
And you can you explain how we take DMT? I know in your experience this was with IV, and this is very short trip. So can you explain a little bit how technical this is to take DMT?
Sure. Well, so DMT was first found in psychedelic plants from the Amazon,
Like
and
ayahuasca, right?
like ayahuasca, and some of the snuffs
Okay.
which the indigenous folks use in the Amazon. Um, so it was first discovered to be psychedelic in Budapest, Hungary, and on the 1950s. Stephen Jara was, I'm a psychiatrist in Hungary, back then, was interested in DMT, and he took it orally, like LSD or like psilocybin, but oral DMT had no effect. And so he, hit upon the idea of, well, maybe it needs to be injected. And so he injected himself intramuscularly, and discovered it was quite profoundly psychedelic.
Hmm.
And so then that opened up the era of clinical research with DMT,
Hmm.
and all of those studies, other than just maybe one or two, gave it intramuscularly. On the street, though, when it became a drug of abuse, it was always kind of a minor drug of abuse in the beginning. It was smoked, or free base. You vaporize it and you inhale the vapors. And in either case, intramuscular or smoked, the effects are very fast. Within a few heartbeats, they peak in a few minutes, and you're pretty much normal within a half hour to 45 minutes. Um, so because my study was a clinical research psychopharmacology study, y we needed to standardize as many of the factors as we could. And if you smoke DMT, you cough, you may not
Exactly.
get enough in. Who knows what it's doing to your lungs? So we decided to use it in the injected form.
Hmm.
Because my funding came from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. I wanted to replicate the field use of DMT. So a small number of our volunteers had smoked the drug previously,
Hmm.
and we brought them in to compare the intramuscular route of administration with the smoked, because we wanted to replicate the smoked effect as carefully as we could. And the first volunteer that we gave IM, or intramuscular DMT, to, he said it's not like smoked. It's slower. It isn't as intense. It's prolonged. It isn't as good. So we just immediately switched to the intravenous route. Um, yeah, and all the rest of our studies, volunteers, um, received it intravenously.
Hmm. And so let's say now we're in 2024. So your studies were in the 90s, 1990 to 1995, I believe.
Right.
So I guess now I would expect it to be more accessible, but we don't really hear about DMT in a therapy. Like if I wanted to go see a therapist and experience DMT, how accessible is it?
Well, the psychedelics overall are still not, really available as,
True.
psychotherapeutic aids. I'm at least above board. Um, Most of the studies have used, psilocybin,
Yeah.
a small, which occurs in magic mushrooms.
Mhm.
A smaller number are using LSD, which was, the main, drug used early on in the first wave of human research. DMT still is a bit, player, when it comes to being studied within the research environment as a, psychotherapeutic agent. There's a group or a, pharmaceutical company in England, Small Pharma, which is using DMT in some depression studies.
Mhm.
And there is a paper came out of Yale a couple of years ago using it for depression as well. Um, there's more studies using ayahuasca. Actually
Really?
in Brazil, as an antidepressant, anti-anxiety agent, anti-substance abuse agent.
Mm.
It's a but still it's a relatively niche
Mhm.
compound. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is if you're doing psychotherapy along with the intoxicated state, the DMT effect is so brief and so
Yeah.
debilitating that you really can't interact with the patient when they're under the influence.
Mhm.
Um, the other is that it's just too weird. It isn't going to give you like a mystical experience of um, you know insights into your past or
Mhm.
emotional breakthroughs or thing. It transports you into this world of light where there are these beings that interact with you,
Yeah.
and that is the most unique aspect of the DMT experience. And, to the extent that those kinds of things occur within other psychedelic states like psilocybin or like LSD, it's either, not as common or as downplayed in order to mainstream it more readily than might, be the case with the more consistent, um, strange, quality of the DMT world.
You just mentioned the beings. That's a very interesting part, and we can go there. I wanted to go maybe later, but you just mentioned them, so I think a lot of people will be having a question mark, like what are those beings, and um, what are these experiences? Like, can we assume that they're hallucinations, or are they real, in your opinion?
Well, they're real in the mind. They're as convincingly real as everyday reality. And in fact, one of the most common refrains I heard from our volunteers when they came out of the DMT state, was it, was, that state, that experience felt more real than real. Uh, more real in everyday reality, more convincing, more meaningful, more containing truth.
Wow.
Um, which is strange. You give a drug, it starts working in a few heartbeats, and you're in this completely alien world that you feel is more real than this world. It's a very strange thing.
Yeah.
And especially it's strange that our brain, produces, this chemical. Um, but be that as it may, one of the features of the DMT state, which feels so real, is contact with these beings or entities or whatever you would like to call them.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and they can take all kinds of forms and shapes. Um, like furniture, robots, humanoids, bees, ants, cactus. Machines, all kinds of things. Yeah, and they communicate. They interact with the observer. Um,
Mm.
they seem powerful. They seem sentient. They're intelligent and aware.
Intelligent.
Um, Yeah, so what are they? Where
Yeah.
do they reside? What's their nature? Yeah, we
Hmm.
just don't really know. I think the more expedient approach would be to just generically describe them as being previously invisible, and they appear, and I'm under the influence of DMT. Uh, and obviously, they are the result of changes in our brain chemistry.
Hmm.
Whether it's completely or solely the result of a change in our brain chemistry, or if the brain chemistry now allows us to perceive freestanding objective realities that we normally can't, like a microscope or a telescope.
Yeah.
That is just that's just hard to say.
Right.
um, there are some studies, one in London and one in Basel, Switzerland, which are using an extended infusion of DMT, like 30 minutes or a half hour or even 90 minutes.
Wow.
And one of the goals of those studies is to expand and extend and prolong contact with the beings,
Mm.
to interact with them without the time pressure of
And the
just
interruption that always comes.
yeah, otherwise you're just in that state for 2 to 5 minutes, and you orient yourself and you start communicating and you start coming down.
Hmm.
So with a more extended state, you can interact with the beings in a more leisurely manner, so to speak.
So it's being studied right now. I'm wondering, is does that mean that these beings are being encountered every single time we are on DMT, or is it just random?
I'd say more often than not.
Really? Okay. So it was like something that you encounter on a regular basis while doing your research.
Yeah.
And in your book, you mentioned the word reptilian because some people reported to you that they had experiences with reptilian, and this is a trigger word to me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one because it sounds so far-fetched and so wild. And I wonder, as a scientist, how challenging was it for you at first to accept what you were receiving from your patients and to actually write about it, and how was it received by your peers at
hmm
first?
Well, the reptilian aspect is strange. Obviously, it isn't infrequently reported either. There were two striking cases of reptilian encounters in our study. One was somebody encountering these reptilian things, and they opened up their bodies and demonstrated reproduction.
Yeah.
This is how it works. The other was more terrifying. It was a volunteer who was pinned, by alligators or by crocodiles, and was anally raped,
Cool.
by them.
Wow. So intense.
So that was obviously horrifying. He dropped
Yeah.
out of the study. He got a little freaked, and we had to, do some therapy with him over the next few weeks or month.
Wow.
And he recovered and was fine. He stopped doing drugs, that's for sure.
Okay.
But yeah, so it could be very benevolent encounter with reptilian beings, or horrifying. Um, reptiles are alien. Uh, you know, if you're looking for a metaphor within the natural world, for strange things, reptiles are your best candidate.
Mhm.
They've got eyes and mouths and noses, but they're cold-blooded, they're scaly, they look strange.
Yeah.
So one could say it's the brain's attempt to communicate to you a certain quality of information,
Mhm.
and the quality of that information is very unusual, slightly scary, very alien.
Right.
So that could be one of the ways to understand the presence of reptilian beings in altered states. um Well, so how did I, deal with these stories?
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't easy at first. Like I interviewed, 19, people before starting the study. People who had smoked, DMT, regularly and were, familiar with the experience, because I wanted a sense of what to expect.
Right.
And it was a very, frequent refrain from the from these informants that, be prepared to meet, for your subjects, to report encounters with beings. And, so I wrote it down, and I even, put, some questions in our questionnaire about encountering beings. But I was unprepared, to be honest, for how, frequently those reports, uh, um, came back, from the volunteers. At first I was skeptical. Like as a, psychopharmacologist, as a, Freudian psychiatrist, as a Zen Buddhist, I was, looking at all of those reports as, something other than what they were. They were like dreams, or they were
Yeah.
repressed impulses or
Mhm.
drives, or they were, Maya on the way, towards your, Kensho of, formless enlightenment, or even archetypes. Even though I don't really, count myself as a Jungian, but still, um, they were other than, the reality that the participant had, just entered into. And even though I was, keeping a straight face, and I was, friendly and inquisitive, I think, people were, picking up on my skepticism.
Yeah.
Uh, and after a while, I just, had to, perform a thought experiment, which entailed, believing the reports at face value.
Mm.
Um, in which case, the volunteers became more, comfortable with, disclosing, the most interesting aspects of their encounters.
Right.
So I, wrote the book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, because I knew I was on top of a great story.
Mm.
It was like the first new study in the U.S. in a generation. There are all kinds of, characters and intrigue and all things. Like, the government, the men in the black suits, the volunteers, DMT, the experiences themselves, the religious aspects, why the studies ended, all those things. Um, and I just wanted to tell the story, nuts and bolts, like from top to bottom. And, by then wasn't in, uh, I wasn't at the university anymore. I had no grants, no, no funding, no permits. So I figured I could just, tell, the entire story.
Right.
One part of the story, which still I think is important for, people, looking at this, field, is, I was very, uh, upfront, very honest about, the adverse effects which occurred in this study. I think
Right.
the chapter is called the dark, side, or, something like that, as opposed to the emphasis, nowadays on, minimizing adverse effects. It's,
Mhm.
very hard to get, researchers, to, freely talk about adverse effects, especially as compared, to the, miraculous effects, of psychedelics. So I think, that's, one of the unique aspects of the book, besides just, letting it all, hang out with respect, to the, stranger experiences, that people had.
Do you think that we're talking too much right now about the benefits and not enough about the risks of taking?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's sort of like we completely went from one extreme to the other. And now we're just very excited about the psychedelics, and there is sort of a trend, I would assume. So what are the risks of taking psychedelics?
Well, the outcome, of any psychedelic experience, is, a combination of the set and the setting and the dose. So, set is, who you are when you take the drug, your mental state, your physical state, your spiritual state, your, past experiences with these drugs or other drugs, your hopes, your fears, your expectations, your intention. those kinds of things. The setting is everything else. It's the environment in which you take the drug, inside or outside, by yourself, or with friends, or with people you don't know, or in a research setting, or for psychotherapy, creativity, spiritual growth. It also includes the set of the people around you. um, what did they think about psychedelics? What did they hope is going to happen? How will they interact with you? Under the influence. And the dose, small, medium, or big. So if you're not prepared, if you're mentally unstable, if you've been using other drugs, if you're around people that you don't know or don't like, then you might become anxious. You might become paranoid. You might become depressed. You might become suicidal. Those are all, brief things which occur within the state itself. Usually they resolve within, 24 hours after the effect of, the drug is worn off. Sometimes, those, can last longer, let's say, 24 to 48 hours, in which case you would, probably, seek some help
Yeah.
from friends, family. uh, I'm a trusted therapist, or cleric, or spiritual advisor. Anything else which lasts over 48 hours, you need help. Like if you're really depressed, if you can't get out of bed, you're thinking about killing yourself, or jumping out a window. If you're still hearing voices, if you're still having visions, if you're confused, if you're anxious, you need help.
Yeah.
So that could be uh, like an emergency room visit. I mean, obviously in a supportive environment. Uh, Medication, even like a minor tranquilizer, major tranquilizer, even hospitalization. The first article that I wrote about psychedelics was adverse effects of psychedelics. It came out in 1984. Because I
Wow.
knew that the objection I would receive in applying to study psychedelics would be, you can't give them safely. What about all these psychedelic casualties from the 60s and the 70s? And I read hundreds of papers, cases, collections of cases, interviews with former research volunteers, and I concluded that if you screen people carefully, if you supervise their experiences carefully, and if you follow them up carefully, the risk of adverse effects was acceptable, like 1%, under 1%.
Yeah. Okay.
But still, a lot of people, but still, if 1 million people take, uh, fully, psychedelic, dose of, psilocybin or of LSD, what's, 1% of a million. It's like, 10,000 people.
That's a lot.
That's 10,000 adverse effects, which are going to require, some intervention. Yeah, so I think it behooves the research community to not paper over adverse effects. If they occur, they ought to be stated clearly and understood. Psychological autopsies for suicides, or
Mm.
severe psychosis. But you just really don't see that in the research literature. It's very hard uh, to get a sense of what is actually going on. That's not so great, within the psychedelic research world.
Why is that?
Well, people, they are driven by uh, the wish the help,
Hmm.
and the wish to become successful and get grants and write papers.
Yeah.
um, there's also a messianic quality, I think, that even influences the research community. um, one of the the arguments as well is, well, let's uh, let's get these drugs out in into into the mainstream as much as possible. And once the adverse effects begin accumulating, we can deal with them then,
Hmm.
as opposed to being proactive. I don't think that's an especially moral or ethical approach.
But
And
it's not uncommon. We see that a lot.
that's right. That's right. It's easier to ask, for forgiveness, than permission, right? So, once things, go south, you could say, oh yeah, right, and let's start, talking about adverse effects.
Hmm.
The media, there's going to be a backlash, saying, well, why didn't you tell us about these things early on?
Mm.
Um, and people are are going to need to explain themselves. There are a smattering of papers coming out. Like, for example, a few days ago or a week or so ago, there was a paper describing the increase in calls to poison control of psilocybin mushroom problems of kids especially coming into you know t- um, to emergency rooms,
Oof.
and I think with the legalization and increased access, which is being uh, pushed by activists. There's only going, there is only going to be, more and more accumulation of adverse effect reports.
So you talk about legalization of psilocybin. Is it legalized in Western world? I'm not aware of that.
Well, Colorado and Oregon and a number of cities have decriminalized
Hmm.
psilocybin and other compounds. Whether they're illegal or not is kind of a gray area. They remain Schedule One substances according to U.S. Federal law. So I think the feds are at this point keeping wait and see attitude about how things go, but it's clearly the case that there are increased emergency room visits, probably hospitalizations, although those data aren't out there yet, and adverse effects, integration, you know, in integration therapy is a growth field within psychology now. And if you speak to integration therapists who work in the field, they have horror stories. They're just overwhelmed by the trauma that people are experiencing from poorly supervised or ill-advised psychedelic experiences.
Well, and that was my question early on. It seems not accessible at this point to work with psilocybin or psychedelics in general. I saw a documentary in Quebec not so long ago, and they were saying that they're starting to explore psilocybin with some people. Example, they have severe depression or PTSD, and they tried everything, and like last resort is psilocybin. So it's not very common that you see someone, a therapist, working with psychedelics, even though we know that it can be very helpful. So I feel the danger with that is that there is like a strong trend. People are becoming more and more interested in trying them, but it's hard to do it in a safe space. So they will explore it on their own. And this is where it becomes dangerous, I guess.
Right, right. Yeah, there is no question that psychedelics in the right set of circumstances can be very helpful.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, for PTSD, for depression, for anxiety, for end of life despair,
Hmm.
cigarette dependence, alcohol dependence, cocaine, opiates, methamphetamine, the list goes on. Um, so in the proper hands with the right screening, supervision, and follow-up, yeah, they're really quite helpful in a way that other treatments are not. So there's a couple of caveats though. One is that uh, just taking them on your own when you're depressed can be problematic. A few months ago, there was that Alaska Airlines pilot who was depressed. Took psilocybin and never really came down, and he almost
Really?
crashed a plane that
Wow.
he was in the cockpit of. Um,
So is it like a
so
psychosis? How did
yeah, well, uh, the diagnosis is dissociation, derealization. He felt that he was in a dream
hmm.
after he came down from the acute effects of the drug, and he hitched a ride on this flight, and was in the cockpit, and and he thought if he crashed the plane, he would wake up from the nightmare.
Wow, that
Um,
was his mindset.
that was his mindset, yeah, and
Hmm.
thankfully, the pilot and the co-pilot just pushed him aside and got things back in order. But if you're depressed and you take psychedelics by yourself in an unstable or unfriendly environment, you can have something that extends out beyond the acute effects of the drug, like in this guy's case.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's one problem is if you have a real disorder and you just treat yourself, or you're in a very sketchy situation with a shaman or a spiritual healer who is unethical and
Mhm.
really doesn't know what they're doing. The other is the tendency to take psychedelics for increased well-being and spiritual growth.
Yeah.
So there's one on one hand, in PTSD or depression, for example, you're treating a medical condition, which is quite resistant to treatment, and otherwise you may die from your drug abuse or your depression. That is different than taking psychedelics for enlightenment.
Yeah.
So I think one can make the argument that psychedelics ought to be increasingly available within using the proper safeguards, guard rails, but there ought to be some kind of yet to be determined demarcation
Yeah.
between medical use and self improvement use.
Yeah.
My Zen community and I parted ways over the whole issue of psychedelics and spirituality, and it was a very messy breakup. You know but one of the lessons which I learned, or which was offered me, which I took to heart, was that it's one thing to use psychedelics for medical treatment, and another to use them to seek enlightenment.
Hmm. Hmm. Oh, someone just wrote in the chat, and I might be wrong, but I think he's a microbiologist. He said it seems that nature took its own ways of making sure that we can't absorb DMT. And I think that's interesting because it's true. Like ayahuasca is a brew; it has to be mixed with two different types of plants, so we can actually retain DMT in our body. And the way, even smoking, it seems so hard. I have friends who tried and they just cough and they couldn't have it in their body. So why do you think DMT is just so not naturally, and not, it's so hard to take it basically? Maybe it's not a good idea to have DMT.
Well, it's in your brain.
Yeah.
So that's an argument I'm against. Saying that we shouldn't experience DMT. But clearly the concentrations in the brain on an everyday y- uh, sort of basis are much lower than pharmacological levels which occur with smoking or injecting, or in the case of ayahuasca. Um, well, it's very widely distributed within the natural world. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of plants which contain DMT.
Hmm.
So I would even argue the opposite. That nature is inviting us to experience DMT, because it's everywhere.
Hmm.
Um, and it could be that the optimal way of taking it is orally, because it's slower onset, it's more manageable. Um, and it was discovered by a uh, by what you could even call a miraculous um, discovery of the combination of these two plants. There's a lot of plants in the Amazon,
Yeah.
and for the natives to stumble upon or discover or somehow figure out that these two plants combined will provide an orally active DMT experience. It really boggles the mind.
Yeah.
So it could be that the preferred or the optimal way of taking DMT is orally. It's a typical Western thing. Extract the active ingredient from the plant and then inject it.
Yeah.
So one could argue against that. But still, I don't think it would necessarily mean we uh, should avoid
Yeah.
DMT.
And we talked about the beings, but we didn't talk about the where. So this seems to you mentioned this is like they are being propulsed in an other world with a lot of light. Other beings have been described a lot. Of many people describe laboratories. Um, you in your book towards the end, you talk about multiverses and parallel dimensions. Do you think that there is some kind of portal to other dimensions?
Well, it's experienced that way.
Hmm.
Joe Rogan had me on his program a couple of years ago, and he said, what do you think DMT is doing?
Hmm.
And I said, it opens a portal, to things that are previously invisible, which is
Hmm.
my generic response, nowadays. You could speculate, that DMT modifies the receiving characteristics of the mind-brain complex in such a way that we are now able to peer into dark matter or parallel universes or the multiverse. Like microscopes allow things that are usually invisible to become visible. Y- you know the the location of the experience is in our mind. There's no there's no argument about that.
Hmm.
But the source of the perceptions or the sensations or the information, we just can't really say. I
Yeah.
think it's easier to look at a more local source, that it's our unconscious, it's our subconscious, it's things which exist in our mind already,
Mm.
dimly aware of, or completely suppressed or repressed in our unconscious, which are then made available to our conscious mind under the influence. The brain imaging um, studies which are emphasized nowadays in in studying psychedelics, they indicate that parts of the brain which normally do not communicate with our consciousness now do. So whether that's a reflection of peering into parallel universes, or simply the contents of the Freudian unconscious erupting into consciousness, there isn't any way to really say right now.
Yeah. Eventually, you think there will be a way to say for sure?
Well, you know, could be like you might at some point be able to develop a camera or an imaging device which can peer into dark matter, for example.
Hmm.
In which case you could compare what you see with this camera with what you see on DMT, but
Yeah.
I think we're some years from that.
Technology is evolving quite fast. We never know.
We never know.
um, Well, there is, of course, I feel like there's so much to say, and I don't want to take too much of your time. But before we end this conversation, I'd like to talk about the. So there's a lot of crazy stuff when we talk about DMT, but how do you think it could be like a tool? And I really ask specifically about DMT in someone's life. Like, how can it be used to improve somebody's life?
Um, well, first, I think, we could look at its, its medical potential, or psychological, psychotherapeutic potential. Um, there's increasing amounts of data with respect to both psychedelics overall, but specifically DMT. That it stimulates both neurogenesis and neuroplasticity,
Can you
which
explain what that
means,
is for those who are not familiar with those
yeah,
terms?
neurogenesis is the production or the conversion of stem cells into new neurons, and n- neuro neuroplasticity is the uh, increased complexity and number uh, of connections among nerve cells.
Okay.
So y- in uh, the case of most major mental illnesses, there is both a decrease in the number of neurons in the brain, as well as a decrease in the complexity of their connections. So from a purely biological point of view, DMT, as a representative psychedelic, could be useful. And there's some animal data suggesting that in conditions of low oxygen, that DMT prevents death of neurons in those conditions.
Oh,
um,
great.
in other words, neurons can survive longer in conditions of low oxygen, in the presence of DMT. There's also some animal data suggesting that treating experimental stroke in animals reduces uh, the extent of the stroke, the size of the stroke, and it also speeds recovery from a stroke in experimental animals. So there is increasing interest in using DMT and other compounds, for uh, brain damage, for
Mhm.
dementias, for traumatic brain injury, those kinds of things.
Fascinating. And you talked just earlier, I forgot a question I had, and I think it's important. In ayahuasca trips, sometimes, very often actually, the whole group will experience sort of a collective experience, like collective visions, themes that will be recurring. And afterwards, when we debrief, everyone has experienced somehow the same visions. So when you talk earlier, you were talking about, the subconscious mind, and this might be just, maybe an access to this subconscious. But how do you explain those phenomenon where a lot of people at the same time experience the same visions?
Well, you could look at it, scientifically, metaphysically, spiritually. One, uh, you, uh, simple explanation is the response, to the singing which occurs in an ayahuasca ceremony. The shamans who have been, born and raised in the Amazon, steeped in the tradition, they learned, these songs, Icaros, uh, which stimulate, certain imagery and, certain emotions in, people across the board. So one could speculate that I'm under the influence of the songs themselves. There's common visions, common feelings which emerge as a result.
Hmm.
Rupert Sheldrake is a biologist, philosopher in England, who's got an idea, or has presented the notion of morphic fields. In other words, everyone is, everyone in an ayahuasca, ceremony is, vibrating at a higher level, and they influence each other
Mm.
in that, vibratory, realm, and as a result, they share experiences. One of my colleagues at a naturopathic school in Seattle, in Bastyr University, she has tried to put this to the experimental test. Like can you demonstrate biological underpinnings of telepathy, which is what we're talking about,
Yeah.
shared feelings and visions. Like um, if you have one person in a scanner and they think or they see certain things, would another person in the next room in a scanner, would their uh, brains synchronize or resonate with the person who's perceiving or thinking or experiencing other things? And so far that hasn't really panned out. So
Okay.
I think it's it still remains mysterious.
Mhm.
The influence of the songs, though, seems to me the most straight the most straightforward explanation.
Yeah. And when I listen to what you say, I realize there's still so much to discover. We still don't know much about the human brain. So I really want to thank you for your time. I'm going to repeat the title of your book. It was written, as you just mentioned before we started, almost 25 years ago. This is not your most recent, but this is certainly your best selling book. So this is called DMT, the spirit molecule. In French, it's called DMT, la molécule de l'esprit. It has been translated, and you have other books. We can find them on Amazon, or I guess anyone who doesn't want to write to buy on Amazon, you can find them at any libraries. Thanks for your time. Uh, is there anything you wanted to add before we wrap this up?
Um, well, let's see. Well, speaking of well, speaking of other books, people can contact me, through my website, rickstrassman.com, and
Mhm.
I do sell books on my website,
Oh, cool.
and I will inscribe and sign them as well.
So would
Um,
you recommend people buy through your website? I guess that's your favorite way to purchase?
Sure. It's a few dollars more, but there's the personal touch, of
Yeah.
an inscription and a signature. Yeah,
Sweet.
so that would be fine. Yeah, and my new book, or my new book, which came out a couple of years ago, is called the Psychedelic Handbook,
Mhm.
which is a short primer of the field, written by someone with a lot of experience within it.
Yeah, and that's great because you don't talk just about DMT, but all the psychedelics. So I would highly recommend this book as well for those who are curious about this. Well, thanks for your time. It was really interesting, and I wish you a very good day for the because it's earlier for you. The day's just starting.
Right. Okay. Well, sure. And thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye bye.